So first off, we're going to start talking about DC since that's where we are, and that's where a lot of your organizing takes place. And DC is an interesting blend of local and federal. So, well, in your experience, how do you see this juxtaposition playing out in terms of the local organizing work that you do?
Well, it plays out in a few big ways. And I mean, I think the number one way is that the District of Columbia, which in and of itself is a very rich jurisdiction now because of so much gentrification, but it's still relatively starved of resources since we aren't able, like almost every other major city in America, to levy a commuter tax on the very wealthy people who come in here from the suburbs. There's actually a huge amount, especially when we're talking about an affordable housing crisis in DC, where you have, roughly 70,000 people who we know are on the public housing waiting list. And actually the problem is much worse than that. We've lost 30,000 units of affordable housing in just about 10 or so years. And you look at big problems like that, which are easily solvable at scale at, the level of $5-6 billion. And that's money that maybe exists in DC, and you could certainly have better progressive taxation, but it's something that would be ultimately maybe a drop in the bucket if you were able to have the same rights that Chicago has, that New York City has, that, many other major cities that have people coming from multiple states and multiple jurisdictions have, to have a commuter tax. I think one other way it plays out is that there's a lot of ambiguity in the criminal justice system because our criminal justice system is controlled by the federal government, which was something of a choice, but also it is impacted by the constitutional status of the district, but it means a few things. So our prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office, are appointed by the president. So you can see how if the president is George W. Bush or Donald Trump, or any president, but you can certainly see it the most if you look at people like that, and they are appointing who is going to be in charge of the whole approach to how crime is going to be dealt with at the prosecutorial level. I think that it creates a system which is highly susceptible to the political influences of law and order politicians. I think we have another situation where all of our prisoners are in the federal system. We have people 600, 700, 800, 1,000 miles away, sometimes for 15 or 20 years, so completely separated from family, friends, everything they know, which has a huge impact on the ability of people to get back on their feet when they get back in the district. And these are things that we have no control over. So in a lot of the work I do, which is primarily aimed at stopping displacement, stopping gentrification, and thinking about how we do quote unquote development in a way that is inclusive and that empowers the lowest down, the most oppressed in our society, and also with combating police violence. We see this sort of local federal dynamic having a big impact not only on our resources, but also on our sovereignty and ability to even change a number of these things, and the ability of Congress and whoever the president may be to, for whatever whim they may have, to be able to put their thumb on the scale and really impact the way people's lives are lived here.
And with those issues, is that something that could be combated directly by statehood, for example?
Absolutely. So if we had statehood, we would have all the rights in the world to levy any sort of commuter tax. And certainly if we had statehood, we could bring back our criminal justice system fully under the aegis of the DC government. Now, that could be done right now in terms of the criminal justice system. That was something that the elected officials at the time in 1996 decided to offload it because of the cost to the federal government. A lot of people now see that as a mistake. There's a growing conversation now in the district about whether or not we should bring it back. But again, that's another resources issue. So you can see how the issue of statehood directly combats it. But certainly in terms of prosecutors, in terms of complete control over the type of system, at least complete control over the sense of the voters of the District of Columbia being able to shape it in terms of criminal justice, that could only be solved through statehood. And so statehood is really an issue that's about, yes, should DC be a state in an abstract reason, but it's a sovereignty issue, it's a civil rights issue, it's a justice issue.
So how does that work in terms of politically charged crimes, or ones that they try to make politically charged, like, for example, something to do with J20 or, Black Lives Matter, or things that are so politicized? If that comes to a head in DC, how does that, or have you seen that be different than how it's prosecuted in other cities?
I definitely have seen it be different in some ways, in the sense of the tenor. So the police in the District of Columbia, which are technically governed by the DC government, they have their own separate relationship, of course, with prosecutors who have no control over, or the DC government has no control over them. So it gives them essentially an out to act in ways that are, whatever the challenges are, and there are many challenges in the criminal justice system here in DC, there is a wide and deep desire among residents to move away from the law and order era of the 80s and of the 90s. But if you have someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office and in the police department who don't fully agree, that's how I think you end up with situations like J20. We had a situation here, or several situations, the most notable one being the Pershing Park case, where the police were required to follow a new set of regulations to protect the First Amendment rights of protesters here in the district, which is something that I don't think the police department wanted to do. Many of those precepts were violated by the way they policed the inauguration protest. And I would argue that part of the reason they did that is they felt, well, hey, Trump is the president. He's going to get his people in as the U.S. attorney, and they're going to cover us, which is exactly what we see with police-involved shootings. The District of Columbia, no one has ever been brought to trial by the U.S. Attorney's Office for a police-involved shooting. So obviously, they are very concerned with and desirous of creating essentially a safe space for the police when it comes to killing residents in the District of Columbia. Plus, you have all these federal agencies, of which no district agency has any oversight over in terms of policing, but all of those federal police agencies in DC have arrest and policing powers and have the ability, of course, to kill people, and it's governed by the same process there. And so really it creates so much more vulnerability, and I think it creates such, for residents of the District of Columbia, but I think it increases or creates inside of the police department itself a mentality of, well, we're protected. And even if we're doing things that we know DC residents won't like, we can expect these Trump-inspired attorneys, or even, quite frankly, people who are appointed by, say, an Obama or a Clinton or whatever, because they don't have any electoral pressures on them. And as we've pointed out, or as many people have pointed out over the movement for Black Lives era, prosecutors need the cops to make their cases, and thus they need to be friendly with them. So if you know you never have to answer to District of Columbia residents, what is there to keep you from really defaulting to what makes it easier for you to make all your other cases by having a chummy relationship with all these different police agencies here?
So it's shifting to talk about solutions to this on the ground, the NEAR Act, the Neighborhood Engagement Achieves Results Act. Talk about this community-based approach to crime that directly opposes like war on drug era policies.
Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad you asked that. The NEAR Act is based off of what initially started in Richmond, California. And it's basically a scaling up of something called violence interruption, which is an idea that you can reduce murders, shootings, and increase public safety without using the police by empowering individuals in those communities, particularly people coming back from prison who have a certain level of respect in the community. They understand what's going on. They have relationships there. And we've seen in a number of cities from Baltimore to Chicago to New York to Boston, just violence interruption in and of itself having big reductions in 1 to 3 years' time of 44 to 76% reductions in shootings and murders. And so this is across all types of cities. And so what the NEAR Act does is put in place something that Richmond originally tried to pioneer, which was to say, let's not just interrupt the violence, but let's put in place a whole range of new programs that can help take people away from their life where they felt the need to commit violence and help them get on a different track based on personalized assessments of them. So the NEAR Act will empower violence interrupters here, but it's also going to have a stipend program so that people can sort of get into a new position and start to see what's going on. They're going to be individual caseworkers and the like, working with people and helping them figure out what opportunities are out there, whether it be employment, whether it be education, and then helping them figure out what the pathway is to get them there over the course of a year, and then getting them on that path and making sure things are really working out. In addition to that, the NEAR Act is also funding new programs to start to look at and evaluate how the DC government can start to put together all of its resources to say, let's stop being reactive, because, the police are reactive. You call them after something has already happened 9 times out of 10, but to say, and this is the axis of it, violence is really a public health issue. And just like the same way we can solve any disease by looking at what are the enzymes and the like that are at the basis of it and figure out how to counteract them, we can look at what causes quote unquote crime, especially violent crime, and get in front of the problem by dealing with the situations and the social context that led people to making certain choices. So we're really excited to see this rolling out here in Washington, D.C. Like I said, there's a similar program in Richmond. There are similar type programs, although they're not all under the same roof, in Boston, Chicago, New York, and other places. So we're really hoping that what we're doing in the district, which might be the biggest city to go this to this level with these type of programs can really be something that people can pick up from around the country and start to run with and implement where they are too, to, yes, deal with public safety, but reduce the scope of the police in our communities while doing so.
And in particular, DC's had problems because in a lot of the southeast neighborhoods, there are cops that very brazenly wear white supremacist and white power clothing even when they're on duty policing these neighborhoods. I mean, many studies have shown that the presence of cops doesn't diminish the amount of crime going on. In fact, cops are oftentimes very complicit in crime that's going on and perpetuate it in a lot of ways. So how do you feel that can the NEAR Act actually create legislation or create regulations that remove cops from these sort of areas in DC?
Well, you're hitting on a very important point, and this was a point that we really raised with the NEAR Act, which is public safety doesn't mean police. And some people, it makes them feel safe. Some people, because of the rampant police violence, it makes them feel very nervous. And I think our hope in the Stop Police Terror Project and the movement for Black Lives that really push the NEAR Act is that, yes, this is a bridge to saying, okay, if we can, I'm just picking a random number out of the sky, but let's say in a couple years, we have a sustainable 30% reduction in murders, which could take us below 100, which has been very difficult to do in DC without using the police at all. Then the next question we have to ask ourselves is, well, are the police the correct instrument to be our main focus on public safety? And do we need so many of them? Do we need them to be as present? And from our perspective, the easiest way to reduce police violence significantly is to reduce the scope of policing, which means not only finding non-police ways to deal with public safety, but actually getting ahead of the issue and trying to address and eliminate some of the root causes of these things so that we can start to move in a paradigm beyond just policing, which I think is really about social control. It's essentially like the society, for whatever reasons, I would say the economic and social policies of the elites have created an economic situation and a social situation that has a lot of contradictions, a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And instead of actually addressing them, which makes sense since the things we did caused them, we're just going to put the police there like holding a lid on a boiling pot. And ultimately, to me, that seems like it's not much of a solution. It's just a finger in the dike at best. And at most, it's an extremely oppressive, almost semi-colonial form of existence in many oppressed communities around the country.
And to go a step further, because you mentioned the Stop Police Terror Project that you're a part of, it lists basic principles, including as long as the police are an institution, there must be clear accountability mechanisms in the hands of the people. Going a step further, is police abolition something that you think is a useful trajectory for these kind of projects?
I do. I think it's a good horizon because I think that when we talk about police abolition, it raises a lot of other questions. And I think a lot of times people feel like maybe it's raised in a flip way, and sometimes it is. But I think when you really think about, okay, we know what the police do. We know what they say they do. We know what they actually do. We know the actual problems that exist. We know the things that they claim are problems that exist. So what does it really mean to have a world without police? And I think it starts to talk about, well, what does it mean to have a world where first and foremost, every person has what they need, and to some degree, based on what we can produce, what they want, right? How do we reduce the need of people to feel like they need to victimize others to survive? What does it mean to talk about the war on drugs and how we relate to not only drug usage, but even the fact that America is a country with such high drug usage, which I think speaks very heavily to the culture in the United States, and a lot of other things related to that. I think it really raises a lot of issues about how we define public safety and how we relate amongst each other. And so I think it's a horizon that really starts to talk about, okay, police came in a certain type of class society in a certain type of way to deal with a certain subset of problems. So if we can get beyond that type of society and those type of problems, we can start to think about a totally different way that we can live in America, certainly, but certainly on this planet, a way that I would consider more sustainable, not just with the earth, but between human beings. And I think that's something that should be a goal. I think that when we look at crime, it's the only social issue in our society that we say can't be solved. I mean, if it's HIV, AIDS, cancer, affordable housing, homelessness, everything, it's like, we're going to end this, we're going to stop it. But crime, quote unquote, is the one thing that we say with nothing we could do, no way we could change it. It's just the way it's going to be. And I think we have to really start to get beyond that. And I think by just saying we should abolish the police, you're raising those questions about, well, what would that really take? And I think on a number of different issues, that really helps expand the conversation about where this country is going and should be.
And another point, expanding that conversation, the idea that communities should be empowered to secure themselves and what that looks like. You know, we've had more school shootings, or like we average a school shooting per day, and with these kind of conversations, the idea of armed community self-defense comes up. And with that, like, what do you feel? Where do you stand on this in the gun commentary, particularly as it relates to community self-defense?
Well, I think as long as there is such a proliferation in America of right-wing, racist, bigoted, vigilante, semi-fascist groups, I think that the right of armed self-defense, especially for oppressed groups, working class communities, is absolutely key. I think that I wish we could say people didn't have to fear from the Klan and the Nazis, and I wish we could say that there was some other force in society that was really going to protect people. But I think what we see in the context of sort of quote unquote free speech, encompassing a lot of hate speech, I think what we see from President Trump and the Republican Party, that's willing to be an incubator for a lot of these far right fascist groups, that there are very serious questions about that. But what the Huey P. Newton Gun Club in Dallas actually raises up, and I think this is an important thing, is they say it's not really about guns, what we do. It's about community, responsibility, discipline, and, like Switzerland is an example where they have kind of a citizen army, right? So most people, until very recently, all had guns in their homes until recently. And there was never any huge, and assault rifles, epidemic of mass shootings, right? Because the context in which the arms were there was political. You know what I'm saying? It was societal, and it had people understood it, they could use it. There was a culture around it. America has this sort of macho, military-based, I think TV and Hollywood-induced sort of lionization of criminal groups musically and the like, sort of element of our culture that I think drives a lot of negative aspects of gun culture. I think there are serious questions about how do we change that culture. I think there are important reforms that we could pursue around the issue of who owns guns, what the access to them is. But I am a little uncomfortable with the fact that it seems like the way gun control policy has played out since the Reconstruction era has been the unilateral disarming of poor Black communities, while the suburban white racist communities under the guise of hunting, which is not the majority of gun owners, have been allowed to deeply not only arm themselves, but to form militias. I mean, I mentioned the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, which is a relatively small group of people focused on community empowerment, and they're treated as a terrorist organization, where in Oregon you have 4,000 strong militias where they have state senators that are affiliated with them, and it's not considered controversial. So I think that's the context we have to consider community self-defense in. It's the context of a real threat to a lot of communities, but I think it's also a context that, in that context, gun ownership is very different. And it's part of a disciplined, organized, political, conscious movement that is very different than what we see, which is, I think, a very willy-nilly approach to either people who live on the suburbs who just are racist and fear robberies and who own guns, or people in many of our oppressed communities who feel the need to own a gun to either stay safe or to conduct their business. And a lot of those nuances have to be dealt with, I think, outside of the context of gun control, inside of the context of what do we do about Black markets, and so on and so forth. What do we do about public safety in inner city communities? How do we address the fact that we have so much racism and bigotry that drives a lot of gun ownership? And I think that's a bigger and broader question we need to discuss. I think there are things that I'd be interested in talking about in terms of gun safety, but I also think that the modern gun control movement is more focused on demonizing gun ownership per se than teasing these different things out. So I think it's complicated, but I do believe people have not only the right to bear arms, but that it's intelligent for many oppressed groups and left-wing political groups to be prepared to defend themselves vis-a-vis some individuals who openly are saying they want to kill us.
Yeah, it's sort of a reactionary, like the liberal stance just became a reactionary stance against the right-wing stance of, we want guns. Then the liberals just said, then I guess we don't want guns, as opposed to being like, well, we want guns in this context, as opposed to just the antithesis of the right-wing perspective. So moving on to the rise in white vigilante violence and a more overt fascism that's come to light since Trump took office, has that changed the way you organize, or do you feel like, it's just kind of the same thing, it's just now that it's out in the open?
I would say that it has changed the way I've organized, although I think to some degree I've always been aware of the reality of these militias, these right-wing groups. Where Charlottesville, Virginia, where I'm from, the National Alliance was briefly headquartered there, formerly the largest Nazi group, no longer. But it was so sort of underground and subterranean. I think it was easier to feel like, well, it's out there, but it's not an existential threat. But you look now at these groups like Atomwaffen, the Nazi group that in less than a year has already been linked to 4 murders and attempted murders. They've had members arrested with huge amounts of explosives and pictures of Timothy McVeigh on their wall, and they're following an ideology of a Nazi from the 80s whose whole thing was lone wolf attack. Like, this is what we need to do to spark the race war, like randomly kill people. And then you look at that in the context of, what we are seeing with very mysterious killings of Movement for Black Lives activists. I think what we've seen, which is a very aggressive attempt by many alt-right type forces to dox people and to bring that into a major way on the internet. And I think from my perspective, and I think from a lot of activists I talk to, it is definitely, and I think appropriately, raised the level of concern, and I think raised the level of importance to being ready, prepared to defend ourselves and our communities, because these people are out there, they're very aggressive, and I think they feel, and we've even seen some comments from some of these individuals, that they are being to some degree shielded and protected by the federal government. And I think the actions of the federal government around being unwilling to call white supremacist terrorism, their eliminating of the one program in the Justice Department aimed at, quote unquote, countering white supremacist terrorism, the comments of Trump in Charlottesville, the fact that a lot of these Republicans are actual racist and at least borderline white supremacist or willing to pal around with them, I think also is heavily emboldening these people to take on these lone wolf attacks, these mass attacks, and the like. And I think in a country like the one we live in, that's very volatile, very scary, and I think it definitely has raised in my own mind the increased importance of thinking about safety, thinking about being exposed, and learning the lessons that I think really we still have from the 60s, where there was a very large number of assassinations. We only hear about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, but many, many, many unknown people, especially local people in the South, were routinely killed during the civil rights period for advocating for their own rights. And I think it's a relevant historical experience to look back on now.
So you've run for office several times, but you're also doing a lot of community organizing. Do you feel that those are mutually exclusive at times, or do you feel that there are certain issues that require a political road, and then certain issues that require just a community organizing road? How does that work with what you're currently doing?
I think it's a good question. My belief is that elections can't bring liberation, because I think that our constitutional situation now is outmoded, it's antiquated, it's based on a way of living and a type of living that I think varies very little. I mean, it makes perfect sense why healthcare was not a right when the founding fathers wrote it in, because then even the richest people were still getting leeches put on them as healthcare. You know what I mean? Now in the richest country in the history of countries, it makes no sense why healthcare is not a right. So I think that we need a new constitution and a new way of living. But what I will say is, I think that the levers of power that exist create a lot of opportunities to create a political expression and platform for a lot of radically different ideas about how we can live. And I think also to fight those rear guard battles about things we've already won that are trying to be taken away. So I view the role of elections in a couple different ways. One, I think it's a great barometer because it gives you a chance to get in front of a lot of people, a large number at scale, hundreds of thousands of millions of people with whatever ideas you want to bring, and get a sense of, if you credibly can bring it, how many people at this moment in time will back it, how many people love it but think it's not time, and how many people hate it. And I think that can give us a lot of thought about what's possible in the immediate moment, in the near future, and in the long-term horizons, which I think if you're really serious about social change is how you have to be thinking. I think it also serves a role if you can get in there in a legislature. I'm much less... I think that executives create a lot of problems because you have to, if you're the mayor or the president, really oversee and implement a lot of really problematic institutions like the police and so on and so forth. But that being said, I think if you can get in a Congress, in a state legislature, on a city council, the bully pulpit you have to start talking about progressive, radical issues and actually get heard is huge. And also the ability you have to stand up for those who no one usually cares about in those arenas. And I think that's important too. So I think when you put those three things together, I think elections and having an electoral representation of mass movements is critically important to actually just getting out there to the broad mass of people what these movements are about, what they're really asking for, what they're really fighting for, and also being willing to show like, hey, we're trying to push towards the future, but we're going to fight like hell to keep everything we have right now too. And I think that's really part of a broader process of what it takes to build what I would consider we need, which is a more broadly revolutionary movement, building a new type of society. And I think really there is no historical example of any revolution or even major reform struggle in any country where elections didn't play a role in somehow, some way, from, the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Castro forces in Cuba, to the Labour Party in the UK and the unions there. I mean, so many things to lesser and greater degrees that we consider progressive, even if they were often won through either mass struggle in the streets or ultimately armed struggle at the level of the state, also had to engage with at some point and in some way with the ballot box. And I think what we've seen in countries like Venezuela and Bolivia and others is that there is also great opportunity in many countries to build out broad electoral majorities that can really change the historic oppression that exists, the sort of 80-20, 80% poor, 20% rich that we've seen in so many of those countries, and that can open the road and open the discussion for different types of futures in those countries and for people around the world to look to.
So do you think then that the structure of our political system, because this is something that also comes up too, looking at different like more flat structure or more cooperative ways of doing things, but do you think that our structure, even on a more local level, is conducive to these kind of immense progressive changes that are required? Or do you think that you'd have to use it as a step and then say, all right, we're etch-a-sketching this because it's not a conducive way to fight oppression?
I definitely would think we got to shake that etch-a-sketch thing and start from scratch. I think that one thing I always point out to people is, everyone is taught in school about the Federalist Papers and Madison, and the most famous one is Federalist Number 10. And honestly, it's very interesting because the issue of factions, which is the big part of that, is being discussed. And he goes through the list of potential factions and it says the most enduring faction that can never be solved, well, it's always going to be this way for the history of humanity, is between rich and poor. And that's why Republican style of government is the best, because it's the best system for maintaining the balance between rich and poor without allowing poor people to determine what rich people have to do, right? And I think the founders were very honest and very intelligent with what they were trying to do, which was create a very limited white male property owning franchise and a limited style of Republican government that would allow them to get super rich as they already were, but to manage their affairs in a way that was not only separate from the crown, but moved away from that sort of one person absolute rule to something that is more of a rule of a class and that had a fair system to regulate that. And I think that recognizing that history and recognizing that the right of women to vote, the right of black people to vote, the right to Social Security, all the changes that have sort of eroded that original conception, if we think about the fact that all of those have kind of had to been sort of ripped from the hands of the richest, most elite people, and that all of our democratic movements have been mainly opposed by the richest, most elite people in the country, I think it speaks to the structure of the country. I mean, even looking at the Electoral College and the way that you can win the popular vote and still lose the election, that was something that was put in place to empower slave owners who always felt maybe we'll be outnumbered somehow and we want to be able to make sure no one can abolish slavery. So our system is set up to have the flexibility to change, which is part of its genius and part of why I think the founders wanted to do it. But to limit the amount of change possible to incremental change and to ultimately over the long horizon favor a more conservative world outlook that would maybe modify the system but not change the system. So that's why I think the American democratic process has tremendous flexibility and has been able to survive and change and adapt to so much over the however many hundreds of years that it's been. But I think it also speaks to the deep inadequacy of it. And I think we see so often the inadequacy of democracy. Like, if you're homeless, you can vote, but you don't have the right to a home. So what's the point of a right to vote if you don't also have the right for a place to live, right? And I think we can see on so many different levels the deep democratic deficits that exist in the country, which I think, I say to people all the time, America is the only quote-unquote advanced industrialized nation that has not revisited its constitution in the post-World War II era. Almost every other, well, in England they have no constitution, but almost every other quote-unquote industrialized country has change, sometimes more than once, the constitutions that have existed in the country. Brazil wrote a new one in 1989. I mean, this is not some new thing. South Africa in 1994, 1996 rather. And so ultimately, I think what we have to see is that it's actually strange that in the United States, we're so unwilling to try to adapt our structure of governing living society to our actual real life situation as it exists in the 21st century.
It actually speaks to that idea that Thomas Paine brought up, the political atom, the idea that you'd create one set of rules for all of posterity, and how unacceptable that is, and how it's the right of every new generation to come up and say, okay, do I agree with this? If not, I'm going to change it, and how agreeing to laws that were set down 200 years ago is absurd. So actually, this is my final question. With what you were talking about with this idea of incremental change, and being that you know so much about the electoral side of things and that side, but also community organizing, do you see the United States, or even parts of it, if that were to break off in that sort of way, do you see us reaching some sort of response to oppression without a violent uprising, without having to resort to that? Do you think that that's possible? Or do you see that with the proliferation of guns, with the proliferation of white vigilante and white supremacist violence, do you see that is unavoidable moving forward?
It's an interesting question. I think it's always possible, but the problem is, for those who want to see progress, it's not really up to us, right? Like, an example I always give to people is the Civil War. So when Lincoln came in, he was not trying to end slavery. No one was really, outside the abolitionists, trying to end slavery. They made what I would consider to be a pretty good deal for the slave owners, which is like, basically, you can't expand where you are now, but you're in so many places, you're pretty much good for like 300-400 extra years, multiple generations. You don't have that much to worry about. But for the slave owners who thought slavery was right, the idea that slavery might die out in 100 years or 200 years or 300 years was still unacceptable to them, because they thought, no, this is our way of life. This is how we should live. It's justified. And from their point of view, was the best way of ordering a society in the world at that time. And I think that most of the elites in the United States feel that this system is basically right. And so I think the question really is, will those who exist in society now, or enough of them, I should say, see the writing on the wall? That I think, quite frankly, if we want to have a sustainable way of living on the whole earth, both with the planet and between ourselves and people, we have to move beyond a capitalist profit system. I think it's obvious that would be the better way for the world to operate itself. And will enough people in elite positions of power recognize that without feeling they have to fight and kill to protect it? Definitely possible. History shows us, however, and I think this is very unfortunate, but I do think it speaks to the nature of elite rule, the elite are never willing to do that, and that they under no circumstances are willing to actually give up and do the right thing without basically trying to mobilize a war against the people who are against them. And so I'd like to think it's possible. I think that it's something that I would hope is possible. I think it's a great measuring stick in terms of the reality of who these people really are, whether or not they would agree. And perhaps we'll see when we see someone like a Jeremy Corbyn. If he gets elected prime minister, he's radical-ish, but he's still trying to work within the system. Will they try to stop him? Will there be a coup, which some people have said? I think that'll give us another example of what's really possible, what could be allowed. So yeah, I'd like to think it's possible. I think it's definitely possible, but I think it's out of our hands, and it's really in the hands of the super rich, wealthy elites. Do they want to start paying attention to what people like you and I are saying, which I think is common sense? Or do they want to say, I'd rather live in a completely nonsensical upside down world where I remain super rich and super powerful? And then I think we had a different situation on our hands.
So the best thing we can do is prepare in terms of our community autonomy and self-defense and building an alternative.
I think being ready to move on every front is always key. And if you're ready, it's better to have and not need than to need and not have.